I want to introduce the individuals who are going to react to the presentation that you're about to hear, and I'm going to call them up one by one. First, Neil Howe, come on up. Arguably the country's most renowned authority on this younger generation, as well as on the generations that preceded it. With the late Bill Strauss, Neil co-authored a series of groundbreaking books on American generations. They first identified the cohort that we're examining today with the book Millennials Rising, and that was 10 years ago. David Campbell, please come up. Where are you, David? There you are. Hi. Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame, and the author or co-author or editor of a number of books on civic engagement, on religion, in politics, and on voting behavior, as well as a book that he and Robert Putnam will publish this fall, examining the religious landscape in the United States. Mark Lopez, where are you, Mark? Right here. Associate Director of the Pew Hispanic Center, a project of the Pew Research Center, formerly an assistant professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Mark was also research director there for the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, also known as CIRCLE. Allison Pond, right here. Research associate for the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, another project of the Pew Research Center. Before taking on this assignment, Allison worked for the International and Government Affairs Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She also worked for the National Crime Prevention Council. And finally, I'm going to introduce the person who's going to lead off this panel with fresh off the presses survey results. Paul Taylor, Executive Vice President of the Pew Research Center. Paul heads the Center's Social and Demographic Trends Project, as well as the Pew Hispanic Center. Paul spent 25 years, this is the most important part of his life, as a newspaper reporter, and he is still remembered as one of the very best the Washington Post has ever produced. After Paul finishes, we are going to spend about 45 minutes hearing from the panel, then we're going to take questions from you in the audience for another 30. Paul Taylor, you are on.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We call this report Confident, Connected, and Open to Change, and over the next few minutes I'm going to try to tell you why we chose those words. I'm going to offer a very fast tour of a very broad landscape. This is a sprawling report. We covered a lot of areas. I'm going to drive too fast. I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you. Numbers are the lingua franca of the Pew Research Center. I'm not going to pause much to discuss what they mean. That's for the rest of the panelists in this morning panel and the rest of the panelists throughout the day. And I hope all of you, I know Judy very much wants to get the audience involved. So let's go.
Before you get started, I just want to say if any of you at the far end over there want to get a better view, there are some couple of empty tables over here, so feel free to make your way over.
I don't know. Should I move out slightly?
Yeah.
This is...
Go ahead. I'm going to move this back.
This is the most diverse generation racially and ethnically in our history. I think most of us recognize that. We are in the period of enormous change. The face of America is changing. By middle of the century, we will no longer be a majority white country. Hispanics are the biggest driver of that change. In this generation, they account for 19%, but they're only the leading edge of a much bigger demographic bulge. 1/4 of all children born in the United States today is Hispanic. Never before in our history has a single minority ethnic group made up this largest share of our young population. Most people associate Hispanic with immigrant, and indeed the Hispanic presence is a result of one of the great immigration waves in our history. It's different from the previous two. They were European. This immigration wave is now about 40 years old. Half of it is Hispanic, 1/4 of it is Asian, and the remainder is Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. But interestingly about this generation is not predominantly immigrant. Gen X, the next up generation, has more immigrants in it than this generation does. Because this immigration wave is 40 years old, this generation is primarily the children of immigrants. And we did a big report about how young Latinos are growing up. Mark Lopez co-authored it. He'll be talking some about that. This generation, like all Americans, but particularly this generation, has been hammered by this recession. I won't go through all these numbers there, but in the first report we did with Judy, we asked them if you are employed full-time, and 50% said yes. Now it's down to 41%. Another way we can express those figures is through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We looked at how many 18 to 29-year-olds are either unemployed or not in the workforce. And what we find is that 37% of this generation today is either unemployed or not in the workforce. This is the highest share for this age group in nearly 40 years. The last time it was this high, and this is of interest, was 1972. 1972, some bad economic times. It also happened to be the last year that we had a military draft in this country, and there were a lot of young adults who wanted to stay out of the workforce because they wanted to stay out of harm's way, literally and figuratively. Let me take a little detour from the economics to talk a little bit about military service. This generation has grown up in a decade when our country has been fighting 2 wars. And yet, it has far less exposure to military service and all the responsibilities and the burdens that implies than any previous generation in American history. Of this generation, today, 2% of the males in this generation, 18 to 29, are military veterans. If you look at the Xers, one generation up, same stage of life, 6% were military veterans of males. The Boomers, same stage of life, 13% were military veterans. The silent generation, 24% were military veterans. So a profound shift here in one of the classic pathways to adulthood. As long as we're on this detour, another important institution where there has been a profound shift is religion. 1/4 of this generation, if you ask them their religion, they say, I'm not affiliated. I have no formal association with religion. That is unprecedented since we've been able to take this polling. It's about half the share of their parents' generation, the Boomers, at the same stage of life. Now, we know many people typically become more religious over time, and we will also add, and Allison Pond of the Forum will talk about this, and perhaps David as well, not belonging does not necessarily mean not believing, and if you look at various practices, daily prayer, spirituality, and other things, actually this generation is not that dissimilar. But let's return to the economic story because it's a very profound one. As I said earlier, this is the most unemployed or out of the workforce generation in modern history. There is a positive side to this coin, and there's almost a seesaw here. Most out of the workforce, they are also the most engaged in college, community college, or graduate schools. The highest share in modern history of 18 to 24-year-olds in this case, because that's the classic college-going age, a higher share than ever before are now enrolled in college. It's a tick under 40%. Never been this high. Some of this is classic long-term change. A modern knowledge-based economy sends a message to everybody. You want to get ahead, you better get some credentials. But that trend has been clearly accelerated in the last few years by the recession. Can't find a job anyway, might as well go get a degree or another degree, and we're seeing a lot of that. What is striking about this is that despite this situation, this is a generation that is very confident about its economic future. We all sort of know, any of us who have had teenagers, or some of us once actually were teenagers, we know that teenagers and 20-somethings tend to think they're invincible, everything is going to work out fine. We see that in a lot of polling data over time. But for this generation to be this detached or this unable to find the first rung on the economic ladder, we ask them a series of questions that we have asked over the years. Do you currently have enough money to lead the life you want to lead, or do you think you will have enough money eventually to lead the life you want to lead? 9 in 10 of this generation say, yes, I'm going to eventually have enough money, or I already do. They are much more optimistic about their own economic futures than older adults are about their economic futures, the older adults who are worried about their 401ks or worried about their retirement, et cetera. On top of that, they're also feeling more upbeat about the country as a whole. A classic question that pollsters have been asking since the beginning of time is, how are things going in the country today? You satisfied or not with the way things are going in America? And there's a line chart that shows on top it's the younger generation, and you'll see over 20 years it's always a little bit more optimistic on that question than are those 30 and over. But the gap is now the biggest that we have seen it in the 20 years that we've been asking this question. So whatever toll on the national psyche that the current circumstances have taken, you've got a recession, you've got a jobless recovery, you've got a financial meltdown, you've got a housing meltdown in terms of values, and you've got 2 wars, it has left a much bigger dent on older adults than it has on younger adults. Okay, they are a connected generation, and this almost goes without saying, but we asked people of all ages in this survey, do you think your generation is unique and distinctive? And all 4 generations, a half to 2/3 said, yes, our generation is unique and distinctive. So that's not an unusual thought. And then we asked why. And the millennials, more so than any generation, the Xers cited technology, but only 12%. By the way, this was an open-ended question. Had we asked this in a closed-ended way, those numbers would have gone way up. But this was unprompted. Fully 24% said something about technology is what makes our generation unique. You see the silence. They talk about their moment of coming of age, whether World War II or the Depression. And I must say, let me take a pause to observe the boomers' definition of their generational identity, work ethic and respectful. And to borrow a phrase that's popular now, I look at that as a boomer and I say to myself incredulously, dude, you know. Either we've had a big personality change over these last 40 years, or there's a whole lot of selective memory going on, because I remember the 60s, at least some of the 60s, and I don't think that work ethic and respectful were at the top of most people's to-do list. I don't think most people had a to-do list. But there you have it. All right, but let's return to the millennials, and clearly they identify. I mean, what's so interesting about technology is this little thing that we all now have in our hands, but they are the leading adopters of. So it's their window on the world. It's their window for information. It's their window for entertainment. It's the platform for their social lives. And in a session this afternoon, we had the great fortune of hearing from Dana Boyd last summer. She's a social anthropologist. And I don't want to steal her thunder, but she made the point to us, and it just made little light bulbs go off. You know, teenagers and 20-somethings need to be where other teenagers and 20-somethings are. And way back in the distant mist of history, before the digital revolution, that place was the suburban mall or the soda shop or something like that. Now that place is Facebook. They need to be there because everybody else is there. So it's fused not just into their generational identity, but into their social lives. And it's a very important item in their lives. And you see it here, you know, in terms of social networking profile, where fully 3/4 have one, and that's obviously a much greater share than is the case with older generations. The digital world allows this generation, well, allows all of us, but for most of us, it's a profound and somewhat disorienting change. The idea that everybody can get on a cyber soapbox and say, here's who I am, here's what I'm doing right now, if you're interested, here's what I was doing yesterday, here's a video of what I did yesterday. Everybody really has the ability to share their lives with everybody they want to share it with. It raises interesting privacy issues, I think and norms around privacy that I think we'll discover later. But it has been dubbed by people more clever than me, because of this power, the look at me generation, they take it for granted that everybody wants to look at them, and they have the power to be looked at. And what's interesting is that in this generation, those behaviors are they exhibit those behaviors not only online with the ability to do it, but offline as well. And for this generation, something of a generational badge are tattoos and piercings, perhaps in the way that long hair was for those of us who grew up in the 60s. But the tattoo numbers, there they are. 38% of this generation have a tattoo, and for most, one is not enough. Just to dig a little deeper here with some more numbers, 50% of those who have tattoos have 2 to 6, and 18% have, 2 to 5, and 18% have 6 or more. Piercings in a place other than the earlobe, 23% piercing in a place other than the earlobe. On privacy, of those tattoos, of those millennial tattoos, 70% are typically hidden beneath clothing. Take it for what you will. So we've talked a lot about how these folks are different, these young adults are different. Let's talk a little bit about how they're similar. Here's a classic. We gave folks 7 or 8 things. Say, look, here are big important things in a lot of people's lives. Tell us, these, what are the most important things in your life, and rank them, or tell us which ones are the most important, next most important. So here's the list we got, and it's a pretty familiar list, as I'll show you. Well, I can leap forward to it. So here's the Millennials, and it's parenthood and marriage on top of career success, helping others, and other things. If you look at the same list and you compare how 18 to 29-year-olds and 30 and above answered those questions, there's almost no variance whatsoever. So in terms of life priorities, they are in the same place. But then let's look at behaviors. How many of this generation are currently married? 21%. And again, if you project backwards in time and look at the same stage of life for Xers and Boomers, twice as many of their parents' generation was married at this stage in life, and more than half of, in effect, their grandparents' generation. So they value marriage, they are not rushing to the altar. And then in terms of parenthood, of course, there has been a social revolution on the linkage between marriage and parenthood that these numbers express. In 2007, the last year, we had 40% of all births were to single mothers. That's basically quadruple the figure that was pertained in 1970. This has been a gradual change over those 40 years. The millennials are part of that change. The millennials, more so than any generation, didn't grow up. Only 6 in 10 grew up with both parents. So broken homes, never formed home, reformed homes, it's part of their life experience. And judging from this, they are repeating that pattern, perhaps even more so. All right, getting near the end here. Open to change. Clearly, their political behaviors, their big support for Barack Obama and his message of change suggested they very much are open to change. But this battery of questions also tries to look at their attitudes towards changing cultural and social and family values. We asked all generations, do you think these newer forms are good or bad for society? And I'm only showing you the millennials' responses here. And they are, in every case, they are more receptive to these newer modes of family arrangements and parenting arrangements than our older adults. That doesn't mean they are approving of them. And interestingly, on single mothers raising children, the majority are disapproving. Only 6% say this is a good thing, 60% a bad thing, and about a third say, neither good nor bad. But in all cases, they are more approving and more receptive to change. They are more receptive to immigration. They are more receptive to interracial dating, et cetera, et cetera. Let me close, I think, where Judy closed. I too am the father of a parent of 3. Mine are Xers, or I guess my youngest is a millennial, and I'm like you, very fond of this generation. And reading these numbers, in many ways, made me fonder. They really are an interesting group. Here was something that kind of teed up our interest in this. Back in 1969, at the height of the kind of age-based social conflicts of the 1960s, Gallup asked what was the generation gap question. You think there's a big gap, generation gap, between young and old? And Gallup found then 74% of all adults said, yeah, there's a big generation gap. We asked the exact same question last year, and to our shock, we found the number hadn't gone down. If anything, it had gone up slightly, 79%. So what is this about? And we've asked a body of questions since then to try to tease this out. And what we find is, this is a gap, but it's not a war. And it's a much gentler generation gap. And I won't run you through all the numbers, but on all sorts of fronts, what we find is that younger adults, these younger adults, are respectful of their parents and their grandparents. When we ask them, what's the source of this gap, they all talk about technology. They all say, and also we have different moral values. Young and old alike say that. And then we ask them, well, whose moral values are better? And the younger adults agree with the older adults that it's the older adults' moral values that are better. It's hard for me to imagine 40 years ago the boomers saying, yeah, we're sort of different from our parents, and they sort of had it right and we sort of had it wrong. We asked adults of all ages, when you were growing up, did you have a lot of fights with mom and dad? The young adults in this age group had about half the number of fights, as they report, than the older adults report they had with their parents when they were growing up. We asked them about about family responsibilities. They clearly see the family in whatever way it either was never formed in the first place, it got broken, it's been recombined. They see the family as the ultimate social safety net. They are living that reality right now in a bad economy. 1 in 8 of them in their 20s has moved back in with mom and dad because they can't find a job. And mom and dad, for a lot of them, now that they're adults, are not just parents, they're actually buddies. They actually do get along. And when you ask them about grandma, and when you ask them, you know, if grandma is in a situation where she may need to move in with the family, is that a family responsibility to take in an elderly parent who wants to move in? The younger adults are much more likely than the older adults or the elderly themselves to say, yes, it's a family responsibility. We're actually coming out with a report next week or next month on the quiet revolution that's going on, the multi-generational family, which went straight down for the decade, the entire 20th century, is staging a quiet revival. These kids are a part of it. It's likely that they're going to be a part of it going forward. So, and finally, when we asked everybody, again, yes, there's a generation gap, but people really don't see that there's generational conflict. Indeed, among all sort of social groups we asked about, the fewest see there are social conflicts. So to sum up, this is a generation that I think by all empirical evidence has been dealt a lousy hand. They've got a bad economy. Their family situation started broken, became broken, got recombined, whatever. The political system is looking pretty dysfunctional these days. There are mountains of debt that we're piling on this generation. We sort of all know those stories. So what are they doing in response? Well, in some ways, it's what they're not doing. Are they protesting in the streets? No. Are they taking over the dean's office? No. They're hanging out on Facebook with their friends. They're in school preparing for careers that it's not clear that the economy will deliver unto them. And they're looking forward to a brighter future. And if you read the cover of the Atlantic magazine, you will see that there are a lot of economists who worry that this jobless recovery is going to last a long time, and it will have a lingering effect on these kids in terms of their earnings and their careers for 10, 15, 20 years. That was the case in the early 80s. It may be the case more. These kids are not worried about that. They're putting one foot in front of another, and what they are not doing is pointing fingers at their elders and saying, you know, this is a pretty unholy mess you've given us. What they are doing is putting one foot in front of another and say, we're going to get on with it because it's our future. There you have it.
Great, great. A lot to chew over there, and I encourage everybody here to read the full survey, the full report, because there's so much material there that Paul has very deftly woven together for us to kick off our discussion.